I am very impressed at the level of debate and discussion, something which in a North American or even an Anglo-Saxon environment would not normally take place. It reflects a level of understanding of fundamental questions. I would first like to address the issue of global warfare. Global warfare has been a project of the US military from World War I. Even though the United States was not actively involved in World War I, there was a strategy to encourage allies and enemies to fight with a view to weakening allies as well as enemies. It's a very important concept in US military doctrine. We see it today with NATO. The United States will let every other country intervene militarily in Syria before it actually intervenes. Of course, covertly they intervene through intelligence operations. So that the concept of the long war, lange Krieg, the long war, this is a term of the US, of the Pentagon. It's not my concept. This concept has existed, and certainly has existed since the end of World War II. And there is a continuum. There's also a continuum in relation to the war crimes committed. If we think of the war crimes committed in the last part of World War II against Japan, against Germany, subsequently during the Korean War, where 30% of the population of North Korea was simply wiped out through extensive carpet bombing, subsequently in the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia. Similarly, the strategy was always to target civilians. The concept was presented by General Tommy Franks in an article written. General Tommy Franks led the invasion into Iraq in 2003. He was the Central Command General. Now he talks about what is described, and it's a military concept, massive casualty producing event. Massive casualty producing event is that you kill lots of civilians, and invariably you blame the victims for the crimes you have committed. And this is a continuum of US military interventionism. In Indonesia, some million communist partisans and their families were liquidated on orders of the CIA. In declassified documents, they acknowledged these killings, and they also acknowledged their role in these killings. They didn't quite acknowledge the numbers, but they blamed the deaths on the victims. And now we see this occurring in Syria, and we're talking about something far more diabolical, where Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist organizations, controlled, financed by the CIA, perhaps through Saudi intelligence or through Qatar, trained, equipped. There's a whole history, I can't get into details, but these Al-Qaeda affiliated operatives are the foot soldiers of the Western Military Alliance. And what do? They go in and kill thousands of people, and then the deaths are blamed on the government of Bashar al-Assad. That was right from the beginning. I happened to be in Syria 2 weeks before the war started in Dara on the 15th of March. When I was in Damascus, the US ambassador Robert Stephen Ford had been appointed, and I understood that something was in the making. Robert Stephen Ford is architect of these death squads, or one of the architects. He worked closely with John Negroponte out of the embassy in Iraq, and was responsible for the setting up of the Iraqi death squadrons. So that when you now look at the Syrian death squadrons, Al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant, these are constructs of Western intelligence, and they cannot be seen otherwise. And we have now ample evidence. The same thing goes for the Libya Islamic Fighting Group in Libya. Now, I say this because, at least in the Anglo-Saxon countries, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, maybe even France for that matter, I won't discuss Germany, but the consensus is among anti-war activists, we are against the war, but we are supportive of the campaign against international terrorism, what is now coined as the global war on terrorism. And this has meant, it's very important, that right from the beginning in 2001, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the anti-war movement, with some exceptions, has towed the line. There was a significant anti-war movement prior to the invasion of Iraq, but the move today is supportive of responsibility to protect, and more than that, many so-called leftists, self-proclaimed leftists and progressives, are in fact endorsing this military agenda, including Democracy Now! In the United States. I have to mention it, okay? There are some very prominent intellectuals, I won't mention their names, but they're prominent leftists. They also support these wars, or they play lip service, or they say, we're against you at foreign policy, but we think Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Okay? All those concepts you will find, so that in effect, we have to address the disinformation which emanates from these so-called self-proclaimed progressives, which cover the landscape. They're in NGOs, they're in peace collectives, and so on and so forth. And it is another level in the propaganda process. It is what I would describe as manufacturing dissent rather than consent. You manufacture dissent, you say, I hate the government, Obama is a dictator, but you still support NATO's humanitarian mandate. And I mean, I don't want to get into details, but Amy Goodman's report on Democracy Now! Was celebrating the revival, the renewal in Libya once these criminals had taken office and NATO had finally surfaced and occupied the country, using Al-Qaeda affiliated operatives, all trained in CIA camps in Afghanistan. So let us understand that the global war on terrorism is a fabrication. It is not a global war on terrorism. It is terrorism, state terrorism, using terrorists as foot soldiers to kill civilians. Now let me also say, there's no divide among us. I mean, there's no conceptual divide, at least within this audience, between being anti-war and waging a campaign against neoliberalism. The tendency has been in many movements is that say, we're against the IMF, the World Bank, but we support NATO. Or they will say, we want climate justice, another kind of phony kind of objective, without, of course, acknowledging that at this moment, concurrent with the most serious economic crisis in world history, plus a global military agenda which threatens the future of humanity with nuclear weapons, we have the Fukushima crisis. Unheralded, undocumented in the mainstream media, but well understood that this is the most serious industrial crisis in world history, leading to the contamination of the Pacific Ocean, as well as the whole western coastline of North America, and of course the food chain in Japan completely. But more than that, again, it is part of the general process of media disinformation and propaganda and cover-up. We have a recent report saying 98% of the what do you call it, the bottom of the ocean is covered with dead animal life, sea life. In other words, a complete destruction of animal life in the Pacific Ocean off the California coastline. Again, this type of information is not normally understood or made known, and it's important that that message get out. But we're not dealing with separate issues. Neoliberalism is the ultimate objective of warfare. It's the derogation of sovereignty of national governments. It's the restructuring of their financial system. It's the imposition of IMF guidelines. We saw it in Yugoslavia. And the objective is not necessarily to win a war. The objective is to destroy countries and transform those countries into territories. And we can see that Vietnam won the war militarily, but in effect, what is Vietnam now? It's a periphery of the global cheap labor economy. It is now entered into an alliance with the United States and NATO. What is Cambodia? It's a proxy state. The national currency is the US dollar. And if we are to learn something from the economics of Rosa Luxemburg, particularly with regard to what Marx called Department 2B, luxury consumption, we see that the two sectors, the two dynamic sectors of the global economy, what are they? Military spending and luxury economy, the whole gamut of entertainment, hotels, casinos, luxury vehicles and so on. That is tremendous expansion. And it is also the source, of course, of co-optation and corruption of these puppet states. So that the objective is not to win wars, the objective is to transform countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, Libya, with 3.5% of global oil and gas reserves, and the largest reserves in Africa, almost twice those of the United States of America. Of course, it's a territory now, it's no longer a country, and that is the nature of global warfare. There is a roadmap, there's a sequencing of military operations. There is also a statement, and if you consult US military doctrines, you'll see there's a statement to the effect that, and I quote, Project for the New American Century, PNAC, that our objective is to wage multiple, simultaneous theater wars in different parts of the world and to win those wars. Now, I should mention that the nature of warfare has changed dramatically. We're no longer in an era of conventional warfare where you go in, and that I think changed in 2003. It's the more recent military operations are somewhat of a different nature. One does not exclude the other, but non-conventional warfare has been used. Cyber warfare, the destabilization of the country's infrastructure, the electricity, communications. Of course, the use of special forces in covert operations, the use of these criminal death squads, and I should mention that the criminal death squads in Syria, all of them are under the supervision of Western special forces, okay? British SAS, French parachutists, and so on. Often they're former because they're hired by mercenary companies, and they also train them in the use of chemical weapons. There's ample evidence to that effect, and consequently those chemical weapons of attacks of August 21st were perpetrated by the Western military alliance, not by the terrorists, okay? I mean, in national international law, paid killers are responsible, but the ultimate architects of those killings of civilians in Syria was NATO and the United States and their allies. But I would say the orders emanated directly from Washington. That's very... And the matter of the fact is that we can prove it, okay? We can prove it. We have all the elements to show that, that the United States government is supporting al-Nusra. We even have John McCain, Senator John McCain goes into Syria, crosses the border illegally into Syria without a visa, and then gets photo ops with some of these Al-Qaeda leaders, buddy. And that then is presented, John Cain with the freedom fighters, but in fact they're not freedom fighters, they're death squads. They're recruited from Saudi Arabia prisons, okay? They're people serving who have criminal records very often. There's a massive process of recruitment, and I can tell you, and this is confirmed by press reports, Israeli press reports, which are not particularly pro-Syrian, but they're certainly pro-NATO. They say, that was a press report already in 2011, that NATO and the Turkish High Command are recruiting mujahideen in different parts of the Muslim world, and that these would be the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance in these countries, including Libya and Syria. And when they finish in Libya, they move them to Syria. So that is the kind of war that we are waging. And it emanates, of course, from September 11, 2001, when the United States government barely declared at 9 in the evening, they declared war on Afghanistan with absolutely no evidence to the fact that Afghanistan had attacked America, okay? Now that sounds absurd because I didn't see any Afghanistani airplanes in New York City. But the Atlantic Council, the following morning in Brussels, they convened and they said, they invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that's the founding document, under the doctrine of collective security. They said, the United States, a member state of the Atlantic Alliance, has been attacked from abroad, okay? But meaning a foreign power, but it was not very well clarified, and consequently we invoked the doctrine of collective security, and we are attacking Afghanistan, even though the Afghanistan government on several occasions through diplomatic channels said, if you have evidence to the fact that Osama bin Laden is guilty of these 9/11 attacks, we are prepared to deliver them to the US justice system. And George W. Bush said, we don't negotiate with terrorists, okay? So that was it. But I can also tell you that that's another, maybe digressing, but Osama bin Laden on the 10th of September was admitted to a Pakistani military hospital in Rawalpindi. Now, anybody who has been to Rawalpindi knows that this is a place swarming with US military advisors. He could not have got into the hospital unnoticed, and then on the 11th he was discharged for his kidney problems. In any case, there's a whole issue of the Osama legend. These attacks were not perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was identified, and the state sponsor of Al-Qaeda was Afghanistan. And we jumped. There was some mysterious report from the State Department which was there to justify the intervention, and there collectively, I'm not saying only the governments, but all the NGOs were applauding, applauding on humanitarian grounds, because this was a massive casualty producing event. And it is there to create what in a previous operation, which was called Operations Northwood, which was a secret plan to attack Cuba using the pretext that Cuban community members in Miami had been killed by Cuban forces, okay? They wanted to use this as a pretext, and they said it will create a useful wave of indignation. People will feel in solidarity, and that's exactly what happened on the 11th of September. It was the solidarity, which I think everybody has, in a sense, towards one's fellow human beings. 2,000 people had been killed, but we didn't ask ourselves who killed them. But what we were told was, because these people were killed, we now have a pretext and a justification to wage war on Afghanistan, which was the first producer of grade 4 heroin in the world, 93%. The Taliban, in their wisdom, had implemented, with the support of the United Nations, the most effective anti-drug eradication program in UN history. They were congratulated in the General Assembly. Actually, shortly after September 11, the production had fallen by more than 90% at 150 tons, and now it's something, and then immediately when US troops came in, the whole production flared up to historical levels and beyond, and I think it's something of the order of 6,000 or more tons, and the United Nations has served to camouflage that. Now, let me look at the broader military agenda post 9/11, but bearing in mind that this is part of a much broader framework of conquest by the United States, which is the United States is not necessarily the most advanced economy, but it has the most advanced military, and it also has the most manipulative financial system. And it is serving the oil companies, the biotech conglomerates, the Wall Street financial conglomerates, and so on. And all of these major actors are behind the war agenda. And I should say that the war has, in a sense, been privatized through the influx of mercenary groups and so on. Nuclear war has been privatized. I won't get into the details, we don't have time. But the nuclear doctrine, which was formulated in the wake of 9/11, was done in consultation with the nuclear weapons industry. And the meeting was held in 2003 on Hiroshima Day, as if that was the day that they were celebrating, okay? And there's a continuity in nuclear doctrine from the Manhattan Project, Hiroshima, to the present, whereby nuclear weapons are now designated as harmless to the surrounding civilian population. The issue of radiation isn't even mentioned in military documents, and they say now we have mini nukes, but those mini nukes are only from 1/3 to 6 times the Hiroshima bomb, but they're considered humanitarian bombs. They've changed the labels on these bombs. But that, again, is something, it's the privatization of war, which is ongoing. If we look at the Middle East today, we have at present, or we had up to until recently, 4 distinct war theaters, okay? We had the AfPak, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, we had Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Palestine, which is also an area of conflict, and Libya. But now what is happening is that these war theaters are in a sense merging together. And we see that the war, there's a process of escalation. The same death squads which are set loose in Syria are now being set loose in Iraq. It's the same organization as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant. And they were involved in the events in Fallujah. Now, what does that mean? It means essentially that the United States and its allies mainly the intelligence operatives, are creating internal strife between these, in Iraq, between these Al-Qaeda rebels, which are supported by US intelligence, and government forces, with a view eventually to weakening the government, as well as ultimately dividing Iraq along sectarian lines. And it is not by accident that the same groups involved in Iraq are also now involved in Syria. It's an open border. It's a desert. It's an open border. And what we must understand is that we wanted to have a map, but the technology was, the German technology was deficient. But no, that's a joke. Spaß. Okay. But always some simple technological things are a problem. But when you have to send a nuclear bomb, that's another matter. But what I'm saying, picture the macro region from the eastern Mediterranean to the border of Afghanistan with China. Okay, that's China's western frontier. It's called the Xinjiang-Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it is also an area where there's a Muslim population. And there's also an insurgency there, which is funded by the United States through Pakistani inter-services intelligence. But that border, that area, that macro region extending from the eastern Mediterranean, the Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, Israeli, Egyptian coastline, all the way to Central Asia, the borders of Afghanistan, Pakistan with China, and then if you go south, it's from the Caspian Sea basin down to the tip of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now that is the area of, first of all, that area is strategic. It encompasses something of the order of more than 60% of the world's reserves of oil and natural gas. There may be some discrepancies in the estimates there, but it is an area which has 30 times more oil than all the Western countries combined. I'm sorry, no, 30 times those of the United States, which has 2%. Okay, so we're dealing with tremendous oil wealth. And of course, the issue of narcotics is a very important question, because it's 93% of the world's supply of heroin comes from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan also has very precious metals and strategic resources. So Saudi, from the tip of the Arabian Peninsula up to Caspian Basin, and there you have an area which is a macro area, which essentially, at the moment, we see the escalation of this military adventure to the entire region. Of course, the ultimate targets are Iran, Russia, and China. And Russia and China allies are Syria and Iran. And at the same time as this macro region is becoming a regional war zone, we see the Asian pivot, in other words, the threats directed against China directly, but these have been ongoing for quite a number of years, in fact, since the 90s. The whole militarization of the coastline, okay, the Chinese coastline, its northern border is militarized, but the whole the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the western frontier with Afghanistan and Pakistan militarized with US military facilities. And so that is the context. And if this war extends into a theater operation, the use of nuclear weapons against Iran has and is contemplated. I know, consulting military documents, we have ample evidence to that effect, and it's very important it's important that people are informed of these developments, but it is particularly important that people who have embraced this progressive consensus and which include a lot of people. Some of them do it because they want to toe the line with, with the leaders. Many of the leaders are co-opted, or they don't have an understanding of the details and the seriousness of this military agenda. I can also tell you that everything is centralized in one location, which is U.S. Strategic Command headquarters in Nebraska. Okay, that is where everything takes place. All the air defense system of NATO, the United States, Israel is a junior partner in this whole process. They can't wage a war without the green light from the United States. Okay, but maybe they will get the green light. Okay, because as I mentioned, they like to make other people do the war for them. That's why they managed that. That's an instrument of conquest. And the same thing with the French. The French are doing the work of the Americans, and in fact they're losing all their sphere of influence in sub-Saharan Africa. So this area which I've just described, plus the area of North Africa, extending it into Central Africa, that is the area now where we see an expanding war theater in 2 or 3 overlapping regions. The operations in Mali, you send in the Al-Qaeda and then you send in the French. You control both sides, again, and ultimately use this as a pretext to destabilize a democratically elected government in Mali, okay, which is an ancient civilization. I mean, in fact, all these countries have thousands of years of history. Now, let me conclude, because I have to, and I'll conclude in a few minutes. There are 3 elements of propaganda. Rainer Rump this afternoon, I think, his presentation reveals how propaganda functions from within organizations. Okay? There's a propaganda within. In other words, within NATO, within the governments, within the parliaments, within the financial establishments, that somehow they believe their own lies. And they have to believe their own lies if they say, well, yes, it's collateral damage, yes, but it's all for a good cause, it's democracy, we're spreading democracy, and they repeat it ad nauseum, they actually believe in it. They are exercise of internal propaganda taking place, okay? Which in the United States they call it the top off, which stands for top officials. Top officials from military, civilian, municipal, business, and so on, and they meet together and they simulate attacks on Iran or some other country, and then they say, well, what do we do in the case of a terrorist attack, etc., etc. And then it's the whole notion of demonizing people, of Muslims, for the simple reason that the Muslims are the people who inhabit the countries that own the oil. Okay? That's if those countries were occupied by Buddhists, they would demonize the Buddhists. That's the only reason we demonize Muslims. You add to that Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, the countries that are not in that macro region, it's almost 70% of crude oil reserves. And consequently, this is one of the objectives, is the battle for oil. It's not the only one, it's an entire process of conquest, of destroying institutions, national governments, and impoverishing people beyond bounds, either through warfare or through the subsequent intervention of the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank is even worse than IMF. Okay? Now, so there are 3 areas of propaganda. One is internal propaganda from within, which we don't know too much about. The second has to do with the tangible media propaganda, which appears persistently in the mainstream media, and when you read the Frankfurter Allgemein or Spiegel or the New York Times, you get that, even though there's some element of information there, but it conveys a consensus, the global war on terrorism, responsibility to protect, and it invades people's minds, and ultimately they may not believe in it, but if they don't believe it, they might lose their jobs, or they might lose their friends, or their wife, or their, you know, that is how it works. It's consensus, it's building a consensus. And the important thing for us is to break that consensus, because it's a very fragile consensus. Now, but let me say that the most insidious, and I'll complete the discussion on that, the most insidious element of propaganda is that which takes place within these so-called progressive organizations. How does it work? I'll mention it in a nutshell. Many of these organizations are funded directly by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the McCarthy Foundation, all elite foundations, not to mention the Open Society Institute, and they very often they don't know about it. I can say that most of these, the Occupy movement is funded by foundations, Anonymous is funded by foundations, many, and then you have Otpor, of course, it's a Serbian organization which now is involved in the revolution business, Canvas. And what do? They go into countries and they advise the protest movement. Now, I can say, and we have to be very careful, but if you look at the situation in Egypt, I'm not questioning the protest movement. It has very strong popular foundations. I'm questioning the insidious role of selected organizations and leaders. MI6 has been infiltrated by MI6 for more than 30 years. The April 6th movement was in liaison, the student movement was in liaison with the US Embassy, and Kifaya, which in Arabic means enough, is funded directly by US foundations, and they met up, in fact, even before this occurred, with Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, and then subsequently with Hillary Clinton. So that again, that is the logic. You support Mubarak, you support the opposition to Mubarak, you create conflicts, and ultimately you dictate regime change. It's part of a very carefully thought out intelligence operative. It's very complex, and but I think that what we have to do is, first of all, we have to educate our grassroots, but we have to start pinpointing people in the left who are lying. Okay? Pinpointing the people in the left who are lying. And I would also say that we have to pinpoint governments who claim to be leftists, but who are in effect, I won't mention the names of the countries, but in effect obeying the imposition of neoliberal economic policies. Thank you very much.